In a mansion marked by silence, a paraplegic millionaire lived surrounded by luxury, but trapped in a pain so deep that he had completely forgotten what it was to smile. Everything seemed to continue the same until the day a new maid crossed that house carrying her own story of losses, courage, and a silent strength capable of moving where no one else could touch. On the first day of work, a simple and unexpected gesture broke years of coldness, awakening buried memories, old wounds, and a transformation that neither of them could predict. Between grief, social distance, secrets from the past, and feelings that were born where it seemed impossible, this story shows how a single presence can return life to someone who had already given up on feeling it. Before hearing this moving story, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment from which city you are watching. The mansion occupied an entire lot in Murumbi, set back from the streets by a high wall covered in ivy, as if the garden itself had decided to hide that house from the world. On the outside, neighbors whispered that no one had seen the living room window lit after 8 at night in the last 2 years. On the inside, silence was an unwritten law, followed by all who worked there, as if transgressing it were the greatest of crimes. Kayo Drummond was 36 years old, had a surname worth millions, and a face that in other times had appeared on the cover of a business magazine with the title of the most promising entrepreneur in the state's construction sector. Today, that face carried an expression that wasn't exactly sadness, but a kind of calculated distance, as if he had decided, at some precise moment, that feeling cost too much. The wheelchair in which he had lived since the accident 2 years ago was state-of-the-art, motorized, discreet, just as he himself had chosen it, functional, efficient, without appeals for compassion. Drummond Incorporações was one of the largest private construction companies in São Paulo, with projects spread from Campinas to the coast, from the capital to the interior of Mato Grosso. Caio managed it from a distance, via video conference, digital reports, and decisions made in meetings he conducted from the mansion's office without needing to shake anyone's hand. The partners had learned to work with this new version of the boss. The company's employees had too. Only the household staff took longer to understand that there was no room there for long conversations, polite smiles, or the lightness that any normal person would expect to find in a work environment. The turnover was intense. Since the departure of Dona Conceição, the housekeeper who had served the Drummond family for 18 years and who resigned saying only that boy had disappeared from within himself, the mansion had seen 6 maids pass through in less than 20 months. The last one, a lady from Minas Gerais, had lasted only 11 days before leaving a letter in the kitchen explaining that she couldn't work in a place where it felt like the air was heavy. On that Monday in August, Caio's driver went to pick up the new candidate at Estação Pinheiros in the late morning. The agency had sent only a brief profile. Mara Santos, 32 years old, native of Petrolina, experience in high-standard residences in Recife and more recently in São Paulo. No negative references, no history of absences. Punctual, discreet. Caio did not go to receive her. He sent Álvaro, his personal assistant, to introduce the house and explain the rules. The rules were always the same, and Álvaro knew them by heart. No music in any part of the house, no unnecessary conversations in the hallways, no asking about the boss's routine, no entering the office without authorization, no receiving personal visits on the mansion's premises. Mara listened to everything without interrupting, with her hands crossed over her lap, her suitcase by her feet, her eyes scanning the details of the living room while Álvaro spoke. She was a woman of medium height, black hair tied in a simple bun, copper-colored skin, a posture that was neither submissive nor defiant. She was just present, like someone who is used to occupying a space without asking for more than she needs. When Álvaro finished, she asked only one thing, where the cleaning products were. That afternoon, Caio was in the office reviewing a technical report when he heard something that made him look up from the monitor for the first time in hours. It wasn't a loud noise. It was almost nothing. A very low melody, almost whispered, coming from some distant point in the house. A simple song without identifiable words at that distance, but with a cadence that he recognized even before he could think about why. It was the same melody that his mother used to hum in the kitchen of the old house in Perdices, when he and his brother did their homework at the breakfast table. A northeastern lullaby that Donna Lucia had learned from her own grandmother, and that she sang without thinking, distracted, while cutting vegetables or folding cloths. Caio had never heard that melody outside of that context. He had never imagined that it could exist anywhere other than the memory of a childhood that seemed to have belonged to someone else. He stood still for a long time, with the report on the screen and his hands motionless on the keyboard. He waited for the melody to stop. It continued for a few more minutes, interrupted by an interval, then resumed lower, as if the singer had remembered where she was, and reduced the volume without stopping completely. Alvaro had already gone to the office with a sentence prepared to explain that the new employee had been warned when Caio raised his hand before he could speak. "Leave it," he said simply. Alvaro was left without understanding. Caio had already returned his eyes to the monitor. Mara didn't know she had been singing. It wasn't a conscious decision, as often happened. She had hummed since she was a child, like someone who breathes, something the body did by itself when the hands were busy. She was on her knees behind the living room sofa, cleaning the baseboards with the firm bristled brush she had carried in her work bag for years, when the melody came out. She only realized she had done it when she stood up and went to get the bucket in the hallway, encountering the absolute silence of the house around her. She stood still for a moment, waiting for some reaction. No door opened, no voice called her. Only the light wind moving the linen curtains of the side window and the distant noise of a lawnmower in the garden. She continued working. That night, in the small but clean room in the back quarters, Mara opened the window that looked out onto the garden and stood looking at the trees for a while before sleeping. São Paulo never became completely silent, and that comforted her in a strange way. In Petrolina, the silence of the night was total and she had learned to like it. In São Paulo, she learned to like the noise. Life was like that, a constant learning of how to get used to what one didn't choose. She had arrived in the capital 3 years ago, after a period she didn't like to name directly, a period of pain and reorganization, of rebuilding with her hands what had been dismantled by fate. The job was the most concrete thing now, the structure that kept the days in order. And order for Mara was a form of dignity. The next day she started earlier than the stipulated time. She discovered where everything was, mentally noted what needed replacement, organized the laundry product cabinet without anyone asking. And when she passed through the hallway that led to the office, she noticed that the door was ajar, and that inside there was a light on since early on. She didn't look. She moved forward. But it was in that hallway, while passing with the bucket in her hand, that Caio saw her for the first time for real. He hadn't planned to look. The door had been left open due to Alvaro's oversight, and what he saw was just the profile of a woman who walked with a calm that didn't seem manufactured, who didn't look to the side seeking approval, who simply moved forward as if the weight of those walls didn't exist for her. Caio closed the door with the wheelchair's remote control, and he stood thinking, for a time longer than he wanted to admit, about how it was possible for someone to walk like that through that house. Mara's second week in the mansion began with a thin rain that lasted for 2 days straight, that kind of São Paulo rain that doesn't decide if it's a drizzle or a downpour and stays in the middle, soaking everything without haste. The gardens became heavy with water, the stones of the path glistened, and the smell of wet earth entered through the windows with an almost inconvenient intimacy. Caio spent his days in the office during the morning and afternoon shifts, and on the covered back porch at the end of the day, with his chair always positioned at the same angle, looking at the beds of red ixoras without really seeming to see them. Alvaro would bring the coffee at 4 in the afternoon, place it on the side table without saying anything, and leave. It was a routine so established that it seemed like a performance. On Wednesday of that week, Mara went to tidy up the porch and discovered that the coffee had been left untouched, cooling beside the empty chair. Caio had gone to his room earlier. She took the cup to the kitchen without thinking much, but while washing it, she observed that the coffee had been prepared without cinnamon. Alvaro had forgotten the detail or simply didn't know. She knew because she had paid attention. The following afternoon, when she took the coffee herself, she added a light touch of cinnamon, as she had observed he did when he served himself. She said nothing. She left it on the table and went out. Kaio was not on the porch at that moment, but when he returned minutes later and brought the cup to his mouth, he stood still for a second before taking the second sip. Alvaro, called later to the office, received the dry instruction. The afternoon coffee would be the responsibility of the new employee. Mara didn't learn of the instruction from Alvaro. She knew because the porch table began to always have a folded napkin next to the cup, and Alvaro simply stopped appearing at that time. She understood without needing anyone to explain. What Kaio hadn't predicted was that delegating the coffee would create a small but inevitable problem. Sometimes she arrived at the porch while he was still there. The first time this happened, he said nothing, and she placed the cup without looking directly at him, turned to leave, and he asked, with a voice that sounded rusty from disuse, if she had added cinnamon. She replied yes, that she had noticed he liked it that way. There was a silence. He didn't say thank you, but he also didn't tell her not to do it anymore. The second time, he had a tablet in his hand reading some document, and when she placed the coffee, he continued reading. She left. The third time, he closed the tablet before she arrived as if he were waiting. She didn't realize this immediately. She only realized it when, upon leaving through the porch door on the fifth occurrence, she noticed that the tablet was closed on the side table without marks of recent use. The screen had no fingerprints, no residue of a hurried touch. It had been closed for some time. Kaio was looking at the garden when she entered. When she left, he continued looking. But now there was a different tension on that porch, something that wasn't discomfort, but also wasn't exactly tranquility. It was on a Thursday afternoon that he asked the first real question. She had arrived with the coffee and was about to leave when he said, without turning completely, "Where is that song from?" She stopped. She was sure she hadn't sung that day. Her head was full of thoughts about a call from her older sister received early in the morning, about bills and plans, and she hadn't hummed anything since the previous week. He added, "The one you sang on the first day." Mara was quiet for a moment before answering. She said it was a song her grandmother used to sing, that she had learned as a child in the sertão, that sometimes it came out without her realizing, and she apologized if it had bothered him. He said it hadn't bothered him. Another silence, this time longer. She was about to leave again when he added, still looking at the garden, "My mother used to sing the same thing." There was no apparent emotion in his voice. It was a factual statement, as if he were reading a piece of data from a report. But there was something in the way he had stopped moving, as if the statement itself had weighed more than he expected upon coming out, that made Mara understand that this was not small talk. She didn't respond with words. She stayed just a second longer in place before leaving, and that second was enough for him to know that she had understood. That night, Kaio stayed in the office until later than usual. Alvaro had left at 6, as always. The house was quiet in the way he had asked it to be, with each room respecting the silence like a rule of architecture. But now that silence seemed to have a slightly different texture. It wasn't the heavy and closed silence of the first months after the accident. It was something with a crack. He opened a drawer of the office's side cabinet and looked at it for a long time without taking anything out. Then he closed it. Mara was in the kitchen preparing the simple dinner she usually made for herself when she heard the soft sound of the motorized chair approaching through the hallway. He rarely passed through the kitchen at that time. She stayed with her back turned, stirring the pot, pretending not to have heard. He stopped at the entrance, stood there for a few seconds, then went away without saying anything. But the next morning, when she arrived in the kitchen to start work, she found a small handwritten note on the counter. There was no signature. There was only one line. Yesterday's beans were good. She hadn't prepared beans for him. She had made them for herself and left the pot on the stove. He had served himself at night without asking. Mara stood looking at the note for longer than would be necessary to read it. Then she folded the paper in 4, put it in her apron pocket, and went to start the day. She said nothing to Alvaro. There was nothing to say. What there was just the beginning of something that neither of them was ready to name. A mutual perception built in small layers, a melody, a touch of cinnamon, a pot of beans, a folded note in an apron pocket. Nothing that could be pointed out as an event. Everything that was impossible to ignore. On Friday of that week, while cleaning the hallway near the office, Mara passed by the ajar door and saw, for the first time clearly, what was on Caio's work desk. Among papers and monitors, there was a framed photograph that she hadn't noticed before. It was in black and white, two young men, looking alike, with arms crossed in front of a wall with graffiti, both smiling in a way that seemed easy, like the smiles of those who don't yet know what is to come. She kept walking, but the image remained. That afternoon, while folding tablecloths in the small laundry room, Mara thought about how much a face can hold. There was something in those two young men in the photograph that was more than physical resemblance, more than the air of brothers that was evident even in black and white. It was the lightness of that smile, the carefree nature of two men who did not yet carry anything too heavy. She knew that difference from the inside out. There were photographs of her before a certain period that also showed a face she barely recognized now, not because she had aged much, but because she had learned things that change one's expression in ways that do not fade. She put the towels away and went to the garden to fetch the clothes that had dried on the line. Late afternoon in São Paulo had that golden and imprecise light of August, when winter begins to give way without the heat yet truly setting in. Mara stood still for a moment with the sheets in her hands before starting to fold them, looking at the red ixoras in the beds she had watered earlier. There was something about that mansion that was at once suffocating and strangely welcoming, like a place that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. September arrived with the wind changing direction, bringing the scent of jacaranda from the neighborhood streets, and a temperature that fluctuated between the morning coolness and the dry afternoon heat, as if the city were making a delayed decision. In the Morumbi mansion, something had also begun to change direction, imperceptibly, like a compass needle that hasn't yet reached north, but no longer points to the old place. Mara had completed a month on the job. She was the longest-lasting of all the maids who had passed through that house since Dona Conceição's departure, and Álvaro had made a point of mentioning this with the neutrality of someone recording a fact, not someone giving a compliment. She had thanked him with the same neutrality. What had changed was subtle and could be described in small details. Caio had started taking afternoon coffee in the kitchen 2 days a week, instead of the porch. There was no justification for this. He simply appeared, positioned his chair by the light wood table near the window from which the side garden could be seen, and stayed there with his tablet or printed documents while Mara worked around him. She didn't change her routine because of his presence. She continued cleaning, organizing, moving things with the same efficient calm as always. And he didn't seem to expect her to change. There was something in that arrangement that worked in a way that neither of them could have explained. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was shared. On one of those kitchen afternoons, he asked the second real question. "Do you have family in São Paulo?" he asked, without looking up from the tablet. Mara was peeling pumpkin for the dinner she would prepare for him, as it had become a tacit part of her responsibilities to cook 3 times a week, a progression that happened without anyone formally discussing it. She replied no, that her family was all in the northeast, most in Petrolina, her older sister in Fortaleza. "How long have you been in São Paulo?" he asked. 3 years, she said. He didn't ask anything else for a while. Then he said, still without looking up, "It's a long time to go without family nearby." It wasn't a question. It was an observation with a bit of recognition, like someone comparing a situation to their own, without saying it directly. She replied that sometimes a person chooses distance because they need a fresh start, and that São Paulo was a generous city to those who needed to start over because it didn't ask where you came from or what you left behind. Caio was quiet for a time after that. When she left the kitchen with the pot, he was still looking at the garden through the window glass. That same week, something happened that altered the tone of the house in a more visible way. It was a Thursday night, almost 10 o'clock, when Mara heard a different noise in the hallway near the master bedroom. It wasn't the soft electronic sound of the motorized chair. It was a muffled sound, followed by a muttered curse, followed by silence. She went to the hallway carefully. The bedroom door was ajar. Caio had tried to transfer from the chair to the bed alone, as he sometimes did when Álvaro had already left. And something had gone wrong. He was partially out of the chair with his arms supported on the mattress, and his body at an angle that clearly hadn't been planned. He hadn't fallen to the floor, but he was unstable, and the expression on his face was a mixture of anger and effort that he clearly didn't want anyone to see. Mara entered without asking permission and without saying anything about what she was seeing. She went directly to the bed, adjusted the position of the mattress, moved the armrest of the chair that had locked, and said, with the same objective voice she used for any household task, "Now lift this side first." He obeyed. In less than a minute, he was positioned correctly on the bed. She straightened the pillow, went to get the blanket from the foot of the bed, and placed it over his legs without him asking, then stepped back 2 steps. There was no immediate thanks. He stood looking at her with that same closed expression, but now there was something different in it, something that was less distance and more scrutiny, as if he were trying to understand what she was made of. "You didn't ask if I needed help," he said finally. She replied that it was evident he needed it, so the question would be a waste of time. He almost smiled, almost. The corner of his mouth moved for a fraction of a second before returning to its place. Mara was leaving when he spoke again. "Thank you," he said, with his voice still rusty, but this time with less armor. She nodded her head without turning and left. The next day, Alvaro found a note from the boss on the breakfast table, instructing that the key to the internal door of the master bedroom be given to Mara for use in emergencies. Alvaro looked at the note for a while, then handed over the key without comment. Mara put the key on the keychain with the others of the house and said nothing about it to anyone. But that night, before sleeping, she stayed awake longer than usual, thinking about how much that man had built around himself. It wasn't just a mansion with marble walls and impeccable gardens. It was an entire fortress made of silence, of distance, of rules that weren't written, but that everyone obeyed. And she, without planning to, had crossed that fortress just by doing what she knew how to do, working with attention, not asking for more than she needed, and not pretending that what was difficult was simple. There was something in this perception that made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't name yet. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling that the ground around her was becoming less firm than it seemed, that the steps she had taken so far were more significant than she had realized when taking them. But this feeling, like all the others she couldn't resolve that night, she put away in the place where she kept things that needed time. She closed her eyes, heard Sao Paulo breathing outside the window, and slept. The following weekend brought a novelty that Mara hadn't anticipated. On Saturday morning, a woman arrived at the mansion without warning, driving a burgundy compact car that she parked in front of the gate with the confidence of someone who doesn't consider the possibility of not being received. It was Fernanda, Caio's cousin, with curly hair and a loud voice, who arrived with a lunchbox of food and a smile that seemed to have been trained to enter any environment without asking permission. Alvaro tried to inform her through the intercom that the boss was not receiving visitors, but Fernanda replied that she wasn't a visitor, she was family, and that there was a difference. Caio, informed by tablet via message from Alvaro, was silent for a moment, and then said with a sigh that Alvaro could hear through the device, "Open the gate." Mara was cleaning the porch area when Fernanda entered through the living room and stopped upon seeing her, studying her with that quick assessing look that some people have, and that says, without words, "I am cataloguing you." "You're the new one," Fernanda said, "the one who lasted more than a month." Mara confirmed with a nod of her head and went to get a glass of water for the visitor before anyone asked. Fernanda stayed with Caio for almost 2 hours. Mara heard fragments of the conversation while working in the nearby rooms, Fernanda talking about the family, about an event that was being planned, about the company, Caio responding with monosyllables at first, then with slightly longer sentences. At one point, Mara passed through the hallway and heard Fernanda say a name she didn't know, and then heard the silence that settled after that name, a silence with weight and boundaries, which she recognized as the type that occupies the space of a loss. October arrived wrapped in heat and yellow ivy flowers that popped up on the sidewalks of Morumbi, as if the city had decided to dress up suddenly. The mansion windows, which spent most of the time closed, began to stay ajar in the mornings, letting in the scent of the trees and a soft sound of birds that Mara had noticed since the first day, but which now seemed closer, as if the birds too had realized that something had changed inside those walls. That month, the conversations between Caio and Mara ceased to be loose fragments and began to have a beginning, a middle, and sometimes a final point that arrived late, when one of the two realized they had stood still for too long without needing anything beyond that. They weren't long or heated conversations. They were exchanges of sentences spaced by pauses, the type of dialogue built between people who have learned that silence is not an enemy. It was in one of those conversations, on a Tuesday afternoon when Caio was in the kitchen with his coffee and Mara was organizing the spice cabinet, that he mentioned his brother for the first time directly. There was no obvious context that had led there. They were talking about Petrolina, about the San Francisco River, about how the drought of the Sertão formed a different type of person than the rain of the South. And then he said, without apparent transition, "My brother wanted to visit the Northeast. He never went." Mara stopped what she was doing. She didn't turn immediately. She gave the sentence a second to occupy the space it needed before responding, with the same calm voice as always. "What was his name?" "Vitor," Caio said. She repeated the name softly, as if she were keeping it. Then she said it was a beautiful name and went back to the cabinet. He fell silent for a while, but it was a different silence from the previous ones. It wasn't the silence of someone closing themselves off. It was that of someone who had just opened a door that had been locked for a long time and needs a moment to get used to the light. In the following days, Vitor began to exist in the house in a different way. He hadn't been mentioned before in any way, despite the photograph on the office desk having been there all along. It was as if the name had been a password that, once spoken, opened an entire chamber of memories that needed air. Caio began to speak of his brother in fragments, that he had studied law, that he was 3 years younger, that he laughed in a way that both irritated and enchanted, that he had spent the last years before the accident working on a project he considered the most important of his life. Mara listened. She didn't ask many questions. She knew from her own experience that memories of loss require a listening that doesn't interrupt, that doesn't rush to fix, that just accompanies. It was on one of those afternoons that she told him about Seu Raimundo. It hadn't been planned. Caio had just finished talking about how Vitor had visited a public hospital in the north zone of São Paulo to collect data for his project, and had come out of there indignant with the failures in the emergency care system, with the delay, with the lack of resources, with the way people waited hours for care that arrived too late. And then Mara said, looking at the kitchen counter and not at him, "That was exactly what happened to my neighbor's father in Petrolina. He arrived at the emergency room with a heart crisis, waited 4 hours, and when they saw him, there was nothing left to do." Caio stood still. Mara continued. "The man was 63 years old, had worked since he was 12, had raised 6 children alone after his wife left. He was the type of person São Paulo never saw, but who supports the country on his back. And he left while waiting in a line." There was a long silence after that, different from all the others. It was the silence of 2 stories that had discovered they shared a wound. Caio said, with his voice lower than usual, "It was exactly that kind of situation that Vitor wanted to change." Mara turned to him for the first time since she had started speaking. Their eyes met for a second before she looked away, but that second was enough for something to be said without words. That night, Caio stayed in the office until late. Alvaro had left at 6, as always. The house was quiet in the way he had asked it to be, with each room respecting the silence as a rule of architecture. But now that silence seemed to have a slightly different texture. It wasn't the heavy and closed silence of the first months after the accident. It was something with a crack. He opened a drawer of the office's side cabinet and looked at it for a long time without taking anything out. Then he closed it. Mara was in the kitchen preparing the simple dinner she usually made for herself when she heard the soft sound of the motorized chair approaching through the hallway. He rarely passed through the kitchen at that time. She stayed with her back turned, stirring the pot, pretending not to have heard. He stopped at the entrance, stood there for a few seconds, then went away without saying anything. But the next morning, when she arrived in the kitchen to start work, she found a small handwritten note on the counter. There was no signature, there was only one line. "Yesterday's beans were good. She hadn't prepared beans for him. She had made them for herself and left the pot on the stove. He had served himself at night without asking. Mara stood looking at the note for longer than would be necessary to read it. Then she folded the paper in four, put it in her apron pocket, and went to start the day. She said nothing to Alvaro. There was nothing to say. What there was just the beginning of something that neither of them was ready to name. A mutual perception built in small layers, a melody, a touch of cinnamon, a pot of beans, a folded note in an apron pocket. Nothing that could be pointed out as an event. Everything that was impossible to ignore. On Friday of that week, while cleaning the hallway near the office, Mara passed by the ajar door and saw, for the first time clearly, what was on Caio's work desk. Among papers and monitors there was a framed photograph that she hadn't noticed before. It was in black and white, two young men, looking alike, with arms crossed in front of a wall with graffiti. Both smiling in a way that seemed easy, like the smiles of those who don't yet know what is to come. She kept walking, but the image remained. That afternoon, while folding tablecloths in the small laundry room, Mara thought about how much a face can hold. There was something in those two young men in the photograph that was more than physical resemblance, more than the air of brothers that was evident even in black and white. It was the lightness of that smile, the carefree nature of two men who did not yet carry anything too heavy. She knew that difference from the inside out. There were photographs of her before a certain period that also showed a face she barely recognized now, not because she had aged much, but because she had learned things that change one's expression in ways that do not fade. She put the towels away and went to the garden to fetch the clothes that had dried on the line. Late afternoon in Sao Paulo had that golden and imprecise light of August, when winter begins to give way without the heat yet truly setting in. Mara stood still for a moment with the sheets in her hands before starting to fold them, looking at the red ixoras in the beds she had watered earlier. There was something about that mansion that was at once suffocating and strangely welcoming, like a place that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. It was on a Thursday afternoon, with the sun still high and the garden heavy with heat, that Caio called Mara to the office for the first time. Not by intercom, not by Alvaro. He himself went to the hallway, opened the door, and said her name with a voice that was neither command nor request, but something between the two, a summons that assumed she would understand. She went. The office was a space she had cleaned dozens of times but had never really inhabited. Large windows with a view of the front garden, shelves of technical books, and some of literature that seemed older than the others. A dark oak desk with two monitors and papers, organized with a precision that revealed someone who needed order to think. And in the side cabinet, the bottom drawer, which was open. Caio went to the desk and stood with his back to her for a second. When he turned around, he had a worn blue folder in his hands, with a label that Mara couldn't read from that distance. He placed it on the desk and pushed it toward her. "You can take it," he said. She approached and read the label. Progetto Accesso, V. Drummond. "Vitor," she said softly, without needing confirmation. He confirmed with a nod of his head. The folder had more than 100 pages. Data surveys on the urgent and emergency care system in public hospitals in Sao Paulo, tables comparing average waiting times by region, reports collected directly from patients and family members, a detailed diagnosis of structural failures, and a draft of a political proposal addressed to the State Health Secretariat. It was the work of years. It was organized with the care of someone who believed in it until the last page. Mara paged through slowly, without haste. Caio stood still on the other side of the desk, watching her. When she reached the last page, there was a handwritten note from Vita, probably written to himself as a reminder. The problem is not a lack of resources. It is a lack of will to see that these people matter. She stood still with the sheet in her hands for a moment. Then she said, without looking up, "The man I told you about, Seu Raimundo, it was exactly that. There was no lack of doctors in that emergency room. There was a lack of someone who looked at him and saw that he mattered." Caio fell silent. Mara closed the folder carefully and placed it back on the desk. She raised her eyes to him and said, "Why did you show me this?" He took a moment before answering. Then he said, "Because I spent 2 years without being able to open that drawer. and you were the first person who made me want to try." The office became very quiet. From the garden came the soft noise of the wind in the leaves of the ivy trees, and further away the distant sound of a siren dissolving into the city. Mara responded, "What are you going to do with it?" He looked at the folder, then at her. Then he said, with a voice that had something of a decision made at the exact moment it was being said, "I don't know yet, but it's not going to stay in that drawer anymore." In the following days, the office gained a new dynamic. Kaio began working on Vitor's project alongside the company reports, dividing his time between the two with a discipline that Mara observed from afar, without commenting but with attention. Alvaro even asked if there was any new demand to forward to the legal team, and Kaio replied, yes, that soon there would be. Mara, for her part, had begun to notice something in herself that she didn't quite know how to classify. There was a new anxiety in the way she waited for the afternoon coffee time, a different attention when she heard the chair approaching through the hallway. It wasn't the nervousness of someone who fears the boss. It was something else, more inconvenient and harder to ignore. She had learned over the difficult years she had crossed to distrust feelings that arrived without an invitation. She knew that sometimes the heart confused gratitude with affection, companionship with love, and that this confusion could cost dearly. Therefore, when she realized she was thinking about Kaio more than would be reasonable for a work relationship, she did what she always did with things that needed time. She put it away and kept an eye on it. But putting it away was getting harder every day. One afternoon, while she was mopping the hallway near the office, he opened the door and said without preamble, "Do you remember the song your grandmother taught you? The one you sang on the first day?" She said yes. He fell silent for an instant. Then, "Can you sing it again?" Mara stood still with the cloth in her hand. It was a request she hadn't expected. She looked at him for a second, then lowered her eyes to the floor and began to hum. Very softly, the simple and ancient melody that had come out of her unintentionally on that first day of August. The song had no fixed lyrics. It was more a sequence of notes than words, a melody that existed before language, the kind that bodies keep without knowing. Kaio closed his eyes. He stayed like that for the entire time she sang. When she stopped, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, with his voice lower than usual, "Thank you." It was his second thank you, and like the first, it arrived with one less piece of armor than the previous ones. Mara went away through the hallway with the cloth in her hand, and only stopped when she reached the laundry room and stood still in front of the washing machine without turning it on. She stayed there for a time she couldn't measure, with the melody still in her vocal cords and her heart beating in a way that was hard to attribute only to the effort of singing. There was a question she had been avoiding asking herself for weeks, and which now was hard to circumvent. It wasn't complicated. It was too simple to be answered easily. Did what she felt for that man have a name? And if it did, what did she intend to do with it? The honest answer was that she didn't know, and that not knowing frightened her more than any definitive conclusion would have, because as long as she didn't know, she could stay in the place where she was, with the work in order and her feelings on pause. If she knew, she would have to decide. She knew with cold clarity the distances that existed between them. They weren't just the obvious ones of boss and maid, of fortune and necessity, of a surname that appeared in magazines and another that appeared nowhere. They were also internal distances, the territories of pain that each carried, and that, even though there were points of contact, did not become equal because of it. But there was also another thing, which she recognized with the same clarity. She had never found in 3 years of Sao Paulo, in all the apartments and houses where she had worked, a presence that seemed so real to her as his. It wasn't about beauty, nor about money, nor about a story of overcoming. It was about the way he listened to her, how he closed the tablet before she arrived, how he had asked her to sing with the voice of someone who needed something they no longer knew how to ask for in another language. She turned the knob on the washing machine, put in the pieces that were in the basket, and stood listening to the noise of the water filling the drum. Then she went to prepare dinner, because life continued. And continuing was what she knew how to do best. That night, for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, Kaio turned on the television in the living room. Not to watch anything in particular, just to have sound in the environment. It was a small change, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't paid attention, but Mara, passing through the hallway with a folded towel in her arms, heard the murmur of the television and stopped for an instant. There was music, background music from some random program, low, inconsequential, but music. In the house where music had been banned for 2 years. She kept walking without making noise, but she took a small and discreet smile to her room, the kind that doesn't need an audience to exist. November brought the heat for good, the kind that makes the sidewalks of São Paulo exhale a steam lightly sweetened by the hot asphalt and the jacaranda flowers that fall and rot with an inconvenient beauty. The mansion was different in ways that any outsider would have difficulty pointing out with precision, but that Álvaro, who knew every variation of that environment, perceived clearly. The office door was left open more often. The living room television played at night, low, but it played, and the boss had asked for the lunch menu to be expanded, that it no longer be just the simple dishes he had tolerated in the dark months, but things with more color, with more seasoning, with more presence. Caio had resumed physical therapy sessions with Dr. Henrique at Hospital Albert Einstein, something he had interrupted 6 months after the accident, claiming he saw no reason to continue. Dr. Henrique, informed of the patient's return, had made a point of not commenting on the absence of nearly a year and a half. He just looked at Caio on the first day back, said good, and started to work. Mara knew about the resumption of physical therapy because Álvaro mentioned it in passing, reorganizing the week's schedule. She said nothing, but that afternoon she made canjica with coconut milk, a dish that was a memory of the June festivals in Petrolina, and left it on the kitchen table without explanation. Caio ate 2 plates and didn't ask what had motivated it. Between the two of them there was now a tension different from all the previous ones. It wasn't the heavy silence of the first days, nor the shared calm of the following weeks. It was a borderline tension, the kind that sets in when 2 people know they are facing something that cannot be ignored indefinitely, but that neither knows exactly how to name without everything changing at once. The crisis came on a Saturday afternoon without warning. Caio had spent the morning working on Vita's project with a concentration that Mara observed discreetly through the glass of the ajar office door. There were papers scattered, calls, his voice arriving in fragments through the hallway. Firm, technical, the voice of someone who had returned to believing in something. In the afternoon, Fernanda appeared without warning, as usual, but this time with an expression that was more serious than normal. Caio received her in the living room. Mara, who was in the garden collecting the porch cushions because of a heavy cloud that threatened rain, heard the conversation arrive in fragments through the side window glass. She didn't hear everything, but she heard enough to understand that Fernanda had learned, through someone in the family, that Caio was resuming Vito's project, and that there was divided opinion about it, that some thought it premature, that others thought he should first stabilize himself completely before getting involved in something so emotionally charged. She heard Caio respond, with a firmness she recognized as new. Stable is not synonymous with stationary. Fernanda must have said something else, because there was a pause, and then Caio's voice arrived lower, but no less firm. This is not about what the family thinks. It's about what Vito started and which deserves to be finished. The conversation ended without Mara hearing the outcome. Fernanda left more silent than she had entered. She didn't stop in the kitchen this time. Caio stayed in the living room after she left. Mara entered with the cushions in her arms, passed through the living room and went to put everything away without looking at him. But when she returned, he was with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly tilted, a posture she had never seen in him, which was less the marble man she had met in August, and more a man who was tired of having to justify to the world what he had decided inside himself. She sat in the armchair to his left. She wasn't called, she just sat down. He raised his eyes. She said, "The family is afraid you'll get hurt again." He fell silent. She continued, "But people who know you from the outside sometimes confuse protecting with holding back, and holding back is not the same as caring." Caio stood looking at her for a time she couldn't measure. Then he said, with a voice that was less armor than she had ever heard in him, "How do you know that?" she replied, "because someone held me back once when what I needed was for them to let me walk." She said no more. He asked no more. But there was something in that stretch of conversation that had shifted a weight they both carried in different ways, as if the words had found the exact place where they needed to fall. After a while, he said, "Thank you for sitting here." It was the third "thank you." And this time there was no armor. It was just a man saying thank you to a woman who had decided to stay close when she could have gone away. Mara stood up, straightened the cushion of the armchair where she had sat, and went to the kitchen. Kaio stayed in the living room a while longer, looking through the window at the rain that had finally arrived, washing the garden stones and darkening the earth in the beds. That night, Mara called her sister in Fortaleza for the first time in weeks. They talked about ordinary things, about the niece who had started to talk, about the heat of Ceará in November. And when the sister asked how the job was, Mara replied, "It's fine. It's very fine." And there was something in her voice that the sister recognized, because she fell silent for a second before asking, with the affectionate caution of someone who wants to know but doesn't want to press, "Is there someone there, Mara?" Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know yet." And she hung up with a smile the sister didn't see, but would have recognized immediately. The next morning, Kaio appeared in the kitchen before 7. Mara was still preparing coffee when he entered, positioned his chair by the window and stood looking at the wet street outside. The puddles reflected the grey November sky with an unreal clarity, like mirrors on the ground. After a few minutes, without turning, he said, "I want to show you something this week in the office about the project." She separated 2 cups and replied, "Whenever you want." He then did something she hadn't seen before. He turned the chair toward her while she still had her back to him and said, "Mara." She turned. He took a moment, as if choosing his words with care, the kind of care applied to fragile things that cannot be repeated the same way if they break. Then he said, "You entered this house and didn't try to fix me. Everyone who came before tried one way or another. You just worked." She stood looking at him without responding immediately. He continued, "And that was the most important thing anyone has done for me in the last 2 years." The silence that followed had a different quality than all those that had existed between them before. It was the silence of after a confession, the kind that asks the other person to decide what to do with what they received. Mara placed the 2 cups on the table, sat on the opposite side from him and said, with the firm voice of someone who knows what they are saying, "You also did something for me." He looked at her in silence, waiting. She said, "You reminded me that it is possible to be in a difficult place without having to disappear inside it." There was no calculated romanticism in that. It was just truth, spoken by a person who had learned at a cost the difference between the 2 things. And Kaio received those words with the face of someone who didn't expect to be seen, but who discovered at that instant that being seen didn't hurt as much as he had feared. They drank their coffee in silence, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of everything that had been said and what was to come. Outside, São Paulo woke up as always, noisy and indifferent, with its buses and its construction and its endless traffic. The meeting with Dr. Fabio Serrano, a health public policy consultant recommended by a former classmate of Vitor's in law school, was scheduled for a Monday in mid-November. Kaio asked Álvaro to organize the office to receive 2 people besides himself, something that hadn't happened in that room for more than a year. Mara knew because she was the one who prepared the coffee for the 3 and who arranged the chairs around the large table. While organizing the table, she saw for the first time Vita's project open and spread out, with new markings in the margins of the pages, notes in red pen that were clearly in Kaio's handwriting, more squared and technical than his brother's. There were underlined parts, discarded parts, parts that had received questions written alongside as if the reader were in dialogue with the text. It was the work of a man taking up the thread of another man. It was, she thought, a way of continuing. The meeting lasted almost 3 hours. Mara stayed in the rest of the house doing what needed to be done, but with a lateral attention to the sounds coming from the office. She didn't listen to the words. She listened to the tone, the rhythm, the moments when Kaio's voice rose a little, not in irritation, but in conviction. It was a voice she hadn't heard before. It was the voice of someone who had found, after a long time, a reason to use their own capacity for struggle on something outside of themselves. When Dr. Serrano and his assistant left, Kaio stood still in the hallway for a moment before going to look for Mara in the kitchen. She was washing the meeting cups when he arrived. "They are going to take the project for debate at the Secretariat," he said. "There is interest. It's the beginning." She turned with her hands still wet. There was something in his face that she took a second to identify, because it had been so long since she had seen it there. It was satisfaction. Not the cold satisfaction of someone closing a deal, but the other kind, the one that comes from within when something that mattered finally finds its way. "I'm happy," she said, and it was simple and true. He stood still at the kitchen entrance for another moment. Then he said, "There is something I need to tell you." Mara dried her hands on the tea towel and waited. Kaio went to the table and placed on it a sheet he had taken from the office. It was a photocopy of a document, with a header she couldn't read from the distance. He pushed it toward her. She approached and read. It was a field survey report done by Vita 2 years earlier, part of the process of collecting data for the project. The research had been done in 3 emergency room units in São Paulo and in 2 in the interior of the state. One of the units was a hospital in Petrolina. Mara's heart went to a different rhythm while she read. In the report, there was a passage describing a specific case used as a qualitative study. There was no full name. There were only initials and age: RMS, 63 years old, farmer, resident of Petrolina, admitted with symptoms of acute infarction. Waiting time for initial care, 3 hours and 40 minutes. She stopped breathing for a second. RMS, Raimundo Mendonça. Santos. She knew the full name by heart because she had heard the family repeat it during the wake, during the days that followed, during the months in which the entire neighborhood processed that loss as if it were its own, because it was. She raised her eyes from the paper and met Kaio's. He said, with a very low voice, "I found this case when I started rereading the project this week. When you told me about the man from Petrolina, I remembered there was a case in Vitor's report with the same characteristics. I went to look for it, and it was there." She stood looking at him without being able to speak. He continued, "Vitor was in Petrolina. He collected this case. He knew the story of this man, used it as an example of everything the project wanted to change. And you are from the same place. You told me about him without knowing that Vitor had already documented exactly this situation." The silence that settled after that had a dimension that went beyond the office, beyond the mansion, beyond that November afternoon. It was the silence of when 2 stories that seemed parallel revealed that they crossed at a point that neither had seen. Mara stayed with the sheet in her hand for a long time. There were tears she didn't allow to fall, not out of pride, but because what she felt at that moment was too big to fit into crying. It was a mixture of renewed pain and of something that was the opposite of pain, the feeling that that loss, which had seemed absurd and solitary for so long, had been witnessed. That there was someone who had looked at it and said, "This matters, this man mattered." That someone had been Vitor. And now it was Kaio who had found that witness in his brother's project and had brought it to her. She placed the sheet on the table with care. Then she looked at Kaio and said, with a firm voice despite everything, "Your brother was a good man." Kaio responded, "He was, and his project is going to get where he wanted it to get." There was a promise in that, and an alliance, not just between 2 names on a document, between 2 paths that had met for reasons that no simple logic could explain, but that were there, real and present, like the smell of cinnamon in the coffee, and the old melody that had crossed that mansion on the first day of August, and changed everything. Mara stood still in the kitchen for a long time after Kaio left through the hallway. There was a strange stillness in her that wasn't sadness or joy, but something that lay between the two, like land that has just received rain after a long drought. The terrain was still adapting to the moisture. It wasn't yet possible to see what would grow. But something had entered. She thought of Seu Raimundo. She thought of the day his daughter, Daniela, had appeared at her door early in the morning with her face white with shock, saying that her father had worsened the previous night and that the family had taken him to the emergency room and that the line was huge and that the nurse had said they needed to wait. She thought of how Daniela had returned hours later with slumped shoulders and a voice that didn't need to say anything because her body had already said everything. She thought of how the entire neighborhood had become quiet that night, the specific quietness of when a loss is so unfair that no one knows what to put in its place. And now there was a young lawyer named Vitor Drummond, who had gone to Petrolina, had sat with the families, had listened, had written, had transformed that pain into data, into argument, into a proposal for change. There was someone who had seen Seu Raimundo not as an inevitable statistic, but as an injustice that needed to have a name. She hadn't known this while Vitor was alive. There was no way to know. But now she knew, and that changed something in the way she carried that loss. It didn't make it lighter. It made it less solitary. When she went to the office later to collect the remaining cups, Caio was facing the window, motionless. She said nothing while she collected what she needed, but as she passed him on the way out, she stopped for a second and placed her hand for an instant on his shoulder. It wasn't a studied gesture. It was the kind of thing the body does when it understands before the mind that the other needs to know they are not alone. He didn't move, but he raised his hand and for a very brief second touched his fingers to hers, before she withdrew her hand and went away. It was the first touch between them, and there was in it all the history that had brought them to that point. That night, the mansion was quieter than ever, but it was a different quietness from all the previous ones. December arrived with the dense heat that São Paulo reserves for the end of the year. That humid and insistent heat that enters through the windows even when open and makes the air inside the house have the same temperature as the air outside. The IPE flowers had fallen, and the jacaranda had taken their place with an intense purple that colored the walls and sidewalks of Morumbi, as if the city needed to dress up before the year ended. In the mansion, the windows were open. All of them. It was a change that had happened gradually, one by one, over the previous weeks, and which no one had formally declared, but which Álvaro had noted with the discretion of someone recording transformations without commenting on them out loud. Caio had completed 6 consecutive weeks of physical therapy. Dr. Henrique had called Álvaro privately the previous week to say that the patient had shown an evolution that surprised even the optimistic parameters of the start of treatment. There was recovered muscle tone in the lower limbs that had been dormant for almost 2 years. There was real progress, still slow, still surrounded by uncertainties, but real. The doctor had said, "He is fighting for real now." Before he showed up, but he wasn't present. Now he is present. Mara knew about the call because Álvaro mentioned it one morning while reorganizing the transport calendar for the sessions. She showed no surprise. She had noticed the change in Caio's body before any medical report recorded it. It was visible in his posture, in the way he moved in the chair, in the strength with which he handled the wheels on the days he used the manual version. It was perceptible in small things that only those who look with attention can notice. In the second week of December, Caio asked Álvaro to cancel all the meetings of a specific afternoon. When Mara arrived in the kitchen that day, she found a note on the counter, written in the squared and technical handwriting she had learned to recognize. "Come to the office at 4. At 4 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the ajar door. The room was different. The oak desk had been reorganized, the monitors moved to a side. On the central surface there was a series of documents, some printed, some handwritten, and in the center, Vitor's project, now with a new cover and the title typed in firm letters, Projeto Acesso, Public Policy Proposal for Equity in Urgent Care in Public Hospitals of the State of São Paulo. Caio was positioned on the opposite side of the desk, facing her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He began to speak, and for more than an hour he presented the project to her in its entirety, not as a boss presenting a report to an employee, as someone who needed this specific person to know what had been built and where it was going. He explained Vitor's diagnosis, the identified failures, the proposal for regulation of maximum waiting time, the inspection mechanism that had been designed, and the changes he himself had made based on the most recent data and conversations with Dr. Serrano. And then he reached a part she didn't expect. He opened a specific page of the document and pushed it toward Mara. There was a section called Documented Cases, with an introduction saying that the individual reports collected in the field were the ethical heart of the project, that no public policy proposal should exist without the human face of the people who motivated it. The first case on the list was that of RMS, 63 years old, Petrolina. But now there was an extra paragraph recently added in italics which said, "The story of this case collected in the field by the original author of the project found an unexpected echo in the trajectory of a person who arrived at this work through paths that life reserves for coincidences that are not coincidences. Her presence in this narrative is testimony that the right stories find the right people when the time is ready." Mara stood looking at the paragraph for a long time. Then she raised her eyes. Caio said, "I wrote that this week. I wanted you to know that your story is part of this project. Not as data, as a reason." She fell silent for a time that would be impossible to measure. Then she said with a steady voice but with something in it that was no longer just control, "This that your brother did, and what you are doing now, this is what changes the world, not all at once, but it changes." He responded, "It's what he believed." And after a short pause with a voice that had finally ceased to be only technical, he added, "And now I believe too." There was something in the room at that moment that transcended the project, the oak desk, the documents, and the December afternoon that entered through the open window with the scent of jacaranda. There were two paths that had converged in a way that neither could have predicted or manufactured, coming from opposite places of the same pain, carrying losses that were not identical, but that had found a point of resonance so deep that it was impossible to pretend that this was just work, just coincidence, or just someone else's story. Mara said, "What happens now?" He responded without hesitating, "The project goes to the Secretariat in January, and I would like you to be here to see that happen." She understood there were two meanings in that sentence, and she chose to respond to the one that was deeper. She said, "I am here." And it was as simple as that. And it was everything. The afternoon continued. Alvaro left earlier without anyone asking. The office became quiet with the two of them still inside, not talking much, but present, in the true sense of the word, which is different from being in the same room and which few moments in life manage to offer. Outside, São Paulo followed its implacable rhythm. But inside that mansion that had been a mausoleum and that had learned, one window at a time, to breathe again, there was something that had found its place. It wasn't an ending. It was the first day of a beginning that the two, each in their own way, and with all their stories in their hands, had chosen to have the courage to cross together. In the days following that afternoon, the mansion continued its silent transformation. Caio had asked for fresh flowers to be placed in the entrance every week, something that hadn't happened since before the accident. Mara chose the arrangement without him needing to specify, and he never commented on her choices. But there was always a second of pause when he passed through the entrance and saw the new flowers, a pause she had learned to recognize as approval. Physical therapy produced a milestone that Dr. Henrique recorded in the week's report, with a care that tried to disguise clinical emotion. In Thursday's session, Caio had stood for 42 seconds, supported on parallel bars, with partial load on the lower limbs, and balance sustained without manual assistance. 42 seconds that were an eternity and an instant at the same time. When he told Mara that night in the kitchen, she listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said only, "Next week it will be more," and there was in the way she said that the same objectivity with which she had adjusted his pillow that night in the room, the objectivity of someone who does not treat the impossible as impossible, but as a practical problem to be solved with patience and method. He laughed. A short sound, almost surprised at himself, like someone who had forgotten that that muscle still existed. But it was real, and she heard it. And neither of them commented directly, because there were things that lost something by being named. Fernanda appeared at the end of that week, as always without warning, but this time with a smile that was no longer the cautious smile of someone visiting someone who is recovering. It was the smile of someone who sees a person who has returned. She stayed with Kaio for an hour, and on leaving she stopped in the kitchen where Mara was preparing dinner and stood still for a moment without saying anything, just looking. Then she said, "He laughed today. I heard it from the hallway." Mara continued stirring the pot. 1 year after that August afternoon, when a woman had arrived with a suitcase in hand and had knelt on the floor of a living room to clean baseboards with an old brush and had let escape, without realizing, a melody that had crossed the entire mansion like a crack of light. The Murumbi house had become something else. It was no longer a mausoleum. It never would be again. The windows were all open on that August morning, exactly 1 year later, and the wind that entered brought the scent of the IPE trees that had bloomed again, as they do every year, indifferent to the story of those who live around them. The television in the living room was on since early, showing a news program that no one watched directly, but that filled the environment with the living noise of a truly inhabited house. In the kitchen, there were 2 cups of coffee with cinnamon on the light wood table. Kaio entered through the porch door leaning on a cane, with the wheelchair folded in the corner, as an object at rest and no longer as a served sentence. His steps were short and firm, with the balance of someone who had rebuilt something that required months of pain and restart and refusal to give up, not out of obligation, but because he had found a reason that was stronger than the comfort of staying still. Dr. Henrique had said, in the last session, that the recovery was one of the most complete cases he had followed in 20 years of physical therapy, and had said this with a professional joy that he could barely contain. Mara was with her back to him, stirring the pot of Sunday lunch, when she heard the steps. She didn't turn immediately. She stood listening to their cadence for an instant, that rhythm she had learned to recognize in the last weeks as the sound of something conquered. He sat at the table and pulled one of the cups to himself. "Good morning," she said without turning. "Good morning," he replied. It was simple, it was complete. Projeto Accesso had been delivered to the State Health Secretariat in January, with Vitor Drummond's name as the original author and Kaio Drummond's name as the person responsible for updating and forwarding. In March, it had been approved as a pilot project in 12 emergency room units in the state, with plans for expansion for the following year. Dr. Serrano had called Kaio on the afternoon of the approval, and his voice, which was always measured and technical, had broken slightly when saying that his brother had done work that would save lives. Mara had been beside Kaio when the call arrived. She had stayed still near the office window without making noise, while he held the phone with a hand that trembled slightly. When he hung up, she went to the desk, placed her hand on his shoulder as she had done that November afternoon, and this time he took her hand and kept it there for a long moment before letting go. That was how things were between them. Without haste, without announcements, built with the patience of someone who knows that what is solid does not need to be shouted. Cousin Fernanda had made a point of organizing a dinner to celebrate the approval of the project in a restaurant in Pinheiros that had been her choice, and which had received everyone in the family with an excitement that Kaio had tolerated with a new patience, different from the icy indifference of before. He had talked, had answered questions, had even told a story about Dr. Henrique that had made the table laugh. Fernanda had looked at Mara during that moment with a smile that said everything without needing a single word. On that Sunday August morning, while lunch cooked slowly on low heat, Mara turned from the pot and stood looking at Kaio for a second before going to sit on the opposite side of the table. He had the cup in his hands and was looking through the window at the garden where the red ixoras were a strong color that seemed impossible to be real. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He paused for a second before answering. Then he said, "About how this house was before August of last year." She waited. He said, "It was a place I was using, so I didn't need to be anywhere else. I wasn't living here. I was hiding." Mara didn't respond immediately. She took a sip of coffee. Then she said, "Everyone needs a time like that. The problem is when the time becomes permanent." He looked at her. She continued, "You left when you needed to leave. Not before, not after." Kaio fell silent for a moment. Then he said, with a voice that no longer had any armor anywhere, Did you know on the first day that you were going to stay? She thought about the question for an instant. Then she answered with honesty. I knew it was different. I didn't know what that meant. He said, and now? She raised her eyes to him and answered, now I know. And there was in those 3 words everything that needed to be said about that August and that September and that October and all the months that had come after, about the grandmother's song and the coffee with cinnamon and the blue folder in a closed drawer and the name of a man from Petrolina in a field report and the short and firm steps of a second chance conquered with pain and method and a reason that had arrived humming on her knees on the floor of a living room. Lunch finished cooking. The 2 ate in the garden under the shade of the mango tree that Mara had asked them to plant in October, still small but already with leaves. There were flowers in the windows. There was music coming from the living room. There was life in that Murumbi mansion in a way it hadn't had for a long time, and which had returned not all at once, not with fanfare, but one open window at a time, one song at a time, one sip of coffee at a time. And on an ordinary afternoon, without any special occasion to justify the moment, Kaio looked at her from the other side of the garden table and smiled for real. The kind of smile that isn't manufactured, that isn't forced, that appears when something inside the person finally finds where it should be. It was the first one, and she knew upon seeing it that it wouldn't be the last. Dear listeners, the story of Kaio and Mara reminds us that sometimes what changes an entire life arrives without warning, humming softly in some room, with busy hands and an open heart. If this story touched something inside you, don't leave without leaving your like and subscribing to the channel. Every subscriber is someone who chooses, as Mara chose, to stay close to what matters. In the comments, tell us, what was the moment of this story that stayed with you? And stay tuned, because tomorrow there is a new story waiting for you here, with the same intensity and the same care as always. We'll see you there. End of story.